Hello everyone, welcome to What If Issei Becomes Game Boss Dark Lord Part 2. Chapter 9. Asia Argento sat down at Calwarner's table as the fallen angel made dinner, the former nun thinking of her past and how she got to this point in her life. It had been very hard, but now, everything seemed easier and much more joyful. Asia thought back on how she had gotten to be under Calwarner's care. Asia shivered as she stared at the grinning rogue exorcist known as Fried Selzen. The crazed priest had been about to do something utterly abhorrent to her when something happened to him. His body went rigid as he slowly turned and was about to say something before there was a wet gurgle, a ripping noise and a soft plop. She whimpered as she saw it was a tongue and Fried was gagging on the ground, blood splashing out of his bloodied mouth. Standing above his crouching form was a black armored figure, a black helmet covering his face as he looked at her before he marched over to her. Asia backpedaled into the wall of the abandoned church, whimpering even more as the figure got closer to her. She could actually feel the darkness radiating off of him in waves as he finally stopped before her, kneeling down then holding out his hand. "Come with me," he said in a metallic deep voice, "I will get you away from this abomination that dares to call itself a priest." Asia couldn't help but look at the armored figure in shock. She had only been in Kuo for a week, Fried dragging her along for his missions to make the sinners pay for summoning a devil. In the end, she had been abused quite a bit, but he had told her no one in Kuo was her friend, they were all devil worshippers and didn't have any human rights or the right to live. This being had torn his tongue out and tossed it aside like it had been a cursed object. Asia wasn't sure what to make of him, but she took his offer hand before being pulled to her feet. She didn't even look back at the still bleeding Selzen on the floor as she left with the armored figure. Now, here she was, under the fallen angel Agent Calwarner's care. Apparently, the darkly armored figure was actually her boyfriend, Issei Hyoudou. It had become clearer after Calwarner had explained what had happened that the puzzle became much clearer. Asia had been falsely summoned to Kuo to be used as Selzen's toy, but Issei had been tracking the rogue exorcist for a month until he had finally caught up to him at the church. This had led to her rescue and now becoming Calwarner's ward. Asia looked at the blue-haired fallen angel and couldn't help but smile as Calwarner was her friend and Issei was like her older brother. A family that she never had before, something she always secretly wished to have but couldn't have because of the church. Until now, that is, so as Calwarner came over and put dinner before her, Asia hugs the fallen angel. Calwarner hugs back before motioning Asia to eat her food. Rain poured down upon the city of Kuo, drizzling down Issei's armor as he watched the nightlife under the rain. He quietly studied the people below as they tried to get out of the rain before he leapt onto the street and walked home, his cape becoming soaked as the rain poured down even harder. An almost mechanical breathing filled his ears as he walked down the streets of Kuo, deep and constant. Issei paused before turning his helmeted head to look in one of the darkened shop windows. By the light of the street lamp, Issei saw what he had turned into. An exact copy of Darth Vader, not a detail was amiss, from the black domed head to the military black boots. On his hip was Vader's lightsaber, ready to be used at a moment's notice. Something in the air shifted as he heard footsteps behind him, making him turn to see his enemy. He spotted a woman in tight leather walking up to him, unaffected by the rain it seemed as she got closer. Her hair was a deep dark blue and her eyes a brilliant crimson red. On her waist were two slender sliver hilts without any blades. The scenery changed from the rainy streets of Kuo to that of the stormy world of Kamino as the woman stopped a few feet away. She gave him a cursory look over before she smiled darkly. "Survive as long as you can." "What?" Issei tried to ask before he was sent flying backwards from a powerful kick to his gut. Calwarner had her arms folded over her chest as she watched Issei get kicked through the wall of the fictional waterbound city by Agent Roman of Firo in the training pocket dimension. It had taken Calwarner a bit to convince her boyfriend to go outside of her house, but it had worked as a way to get Issei into the sphere without him knowing. Now, it seemed that Romanov was toying with him, having him look like Darth Vader as she trained him how to dodge. Not really how Calwarner would have done it, but she wasn't training Issei, now was she? Is Issei going to be alright? Asia asked from her side, the former nun also watching. Calwarner only nodded, yes, he'll be alright if he doesn't get himself too hurt. But that's what training is for, isn't it? I suppose so. Asia said, her hands clasped together as she watched. Issei slowly got off his knees, grunting through the pain as he looked at the hole he had made. No, holes, as he had gone through multiple walls without pause before crashing into this one. He also noticed his armor had returned to normal, but that breathing had remained, but he ignored it as he looked for that woman that had attacked him. Drawing his sword, Issei marched through several of the holes before stepping into a corridor that had white walls on every side before he felt something attack him from behind. Spinning around, Issei's glowing red blade connected with the twin blue blades that the woman had in her hands. She would have cut him in two if her blades had connected, but Issei growled before going on the attack. His crimson blade became a swirling red light as he attacked the woman with furious and devastatingly quick blows. Every blow was a death blow, his blade a tool, an instrument of death itself. The woman causally parried, blocked and deflected his strikes with her own blue blades. Issei growled before trying another tactic, going for her neck before switching where his strike would have landed to her hip. She deflected that as well, smiling at him. "You call this swordsmanship?" she asked, smirking now as they paused. "This isn't even worth my time, it's so childish, it's like you only trained yourself to fight like a fictional character. That is all you know how to do, isn't it?" Issei growled before he was forced to give ground as she launched at him, her twin blue blades coming at him from both high and low angles. He was pushed back before he was kicked through one of the doors into the rainy weather of the fictional world of Camino. She was on top of him, keeping him on the defensive as her twirling blades filled his vision. He grunted from another double bisecting slash he deflected before leaping away onto a platform he had noticed from earlier when they had danced around one another. She pointed one of her weapons at him and smirked, "So this is what Kalwerner said was the defeater of Vali, the White Dragon Emperor. Not likely, beginner's luck, you are nothing but a roleplayer and a medieval armor variation of the Sith Lord. Time that I break you of this false reality you have created for yourself." Issei hissed before answering, "I would like to see you try." She leapt at him, her blades twirling around her before he thrust his arm out, blasting her back onto the platform down below as he thought up the words for the Emperor's Trooper's spell. He then noticed that a panel appeared before him, telling him that the spell had a decrease in price due to the cloning facilities on the current map, meaning he could get even more troopers for a single mana point, which suited his needs just fine. She had set to survive after all. Roman of Firo was panting as her twin custom-built light blades clashed against the glowing red sword of Issei Hyoudou before energy fire caught her off guard. Wide armored figures were converging on her position as Issei sent her skidding back to make a tactical retreat. The energy weapons were that of the fictional Star Wars world, the soldiers a mixture of the Phase 2 clone troopers and stormtroopers of the same world. She wasn't sure how Issei had gained control of the training dimensions warding scheme, but he had clearly shown that he wasn't going to just let himself get killed because he didn't do anything. Romanov's weapons cut through the troopers without remorse, energy bolts deflected right back at their senders as she moved her way towards where the boy had gone. She grunted as a trooper had brought the butt of his weapon around and slammed it into her side before he was relieved of his head. Yet the soldiers kept coming, like there wasn't an end to them at all. Romanov was starting to get a bit worried before she noticed that several of the bodies turned into small squares when they were killed. Frowning, Romanov tried to remember what Kalwerner had told her of Issei's sacred gear. It's based on the super popular MMORPG game, she remembered her fellow fallen angel say. He has a spell that allows him to summon a certain amount of high-level NPC troopers under his direct command for a certain amount of mana as a price. Romanov hissed as she cut down 8 more of the faceless wide-armored soldiers. She had forgotten where this place was, a cloning facility. Meaning that Issei must have used a spell and got a massive mana reduction to it. Gritting her teeth, Romanov ran after the retreating figure of Issei Hyoudou as she cut down any resistance in her path. Asia could only watch in awe as Issei moved away from Romanov as he let the army of wide-armored troopers take care of her. Kalwerner watched as the battle got more heated before rubbing her temples. She said survive and Issei decided to even the odds, she muttered, Asia looking up at her. This training session might just turn into who can outlast the other. Chapter 10. Issei was breathing hard as he walked into the gigantic chamber where the clone embryos were grown, hearing the sounds of blaster fire behind him as he leapt onto one of the circular devices that held the still growing embryos before the sounds of blaster fire stopped. He turned and saw the woman standing below him, her blade still active and panting as well. His grip tightened before she leapt up at him with one of the blasters in her hands and fired at him point blank. The red bolt slammed into his shoulder as he groaned in pain, his arm reaching for the wound. She came at him while his guard was down, her blue blades now one single weapon, a staff. He grunted before defending himself, now really caught on the back foot as that bolt of energy had left his left shoulder in agony. Only able to use his right hand, Issei was at a severe disadvantage as now he had to deal with not only a light energy staff, but a blaster as well. He growled as another blaster bolt nearly hit his chest, but another slammed into his leg. The woman got a few more shots off before Issei had had enough, his left arm turned into a fist before yanking itself back, pulling the blaster out of her hand with enough force that she was thrown off balance. Then he attacked, through the pain and the agony. He used a new style of combat, slow, deliberate, with wide but devastatingly quick strikes. She was forced to turn her staff back into 2 weapons to fully defend herself from this style of combat, so he pressed his advantage. Pushing her towards the edge before holding in a blade lock, shoving his sword closer to her face. Her blades were crossed to block it and she tried to hold it back, but it wasn't enough. She then ducked under the blades and kicked his thigh, making him cry out as her boot slammed into his scorched flesh. He spun, his blade ready to cut her in half before he found himself facing the barrel of the blaster. She looked at him, panting as she held the weapon steady before pulling the trigger. Issei collapsed as he blacked out, not even hearing her say something as he entered the world of darkness. End training simulation, Romanov gasped as she looked at the passed out form of Issei Hyoudou. That was so not how I wanted to end that. The dimension turned off before it collapsed into a small sphere, with Romanov put into her pocket. She turned around, spotting Kalawiner and Asia running out towards them. Asia arrived first and put her sacred gear to good use by healing Issei's body, even though it wasn't really damaged at all. Kalawiner walked up to her and simply glowered at her. "What?" Romanov asked, feeling a bit confused due to the look Kalawiner was giving her. "You do know," Kalawiner said, her voice was deathly calm, "that by telling Issei to just survive, you told him that he was going to die. He was going to go all out to survive and win, you were supposed to be training him on how to dodge." Romanov frowned before looking at Issei. "I needed to gag his skill level first before I started training him properly." Kalawiner slapped her face as she groaned, "Properly train him next time, okay?" Romanov sighed, "Fine, I'll do that once he wakes up and you explain to him what this was." "Fine." Kalawiner threw her arms into the air. Riser Phoenix looked at the screen that connected to his specialized spying drone in the mortal world, his eyes looking at the figure of Issei Hyoudou. The boy was something that Riser decided to use, for he planned to have Riaz as his own, of course, she would be his anyway. But this would be the factor that made it so, having it look like Riaz cheated to win. He smirked as he watched a human mutt defend himself from a rather beautiful fallen angel woman. Yes, he would do. The plan was going to be a rather simple one, indeed, it was pure genius. He would simply summon Issei Hyoudou into the middle of the raiding game that he and his future wife were going to play. It was an inevitability that would happen. However, once summoned, the Kerr would probably think that Riaz was the one to summon him, as her hair was the same color as the symbol. How he was going to make the Phoenix teleportation circle the Gremory teleportation circle. That was easier, using the best illusion magic that one could buy. Of course, he would have to use his own, as using the family money would get him unwanted attention. So would be using the usual magician contacts his family had. No, he would have to look for them himself, make sure they were up to the level needed to pull this trick off. If one item or spell was done wrong, it would backfire on Riser and he would be getting the hot seat. He couldn't have that now, could he? Riser Phoenix, wouldn't allow some Kerr to ruin his plan. Now, to find the illusion magic that would work on devil teleportation spells. He would have to look into the furthest reaches of the magician underground for the magic needed, places that he detested but were necessary in this plan. Turning off a screen, Riser stood up and headed out of the secret room in his bedroom. He walked out of his section of the Phoenix household and towards the family ward line, summoning his queen to join him as he neared the edge of the wards. Eubelina appeared as he stepped out of the wards and summoned his teleportation spell beneath them. With a cruel smile, Riser Phoenix and his queen were engulfed in a fiery orange light and vanished from the Phoenix lands. Chapter 11. Hidden away from any prying eyes of any supernatural factions, beings toiled with plans and plots for the said factions. Disgruntled beings that wanted power, devils of the old Satan faction that wanted their power back, fallen angels that had become disenfranchised with the leadership of the Grigori. This list was growing day by day, in the center of it all was the being that was all-powerful, infinitely so. The dragon god of infinity, Office Ouroboros, felt all those useful beings around her and yet none of them at the same time. She, for that was the gender she had chosen, didn't care about their petty squabbles or desires for more power over their brethren. Mortal concerns were not of her level of need or her wants, power swirled within her bosom as she let it slither and grow. Everyone that had come had been given a gift, a falsehood really, all of her gifts came with a price. Each of her gifts were snakes that would help defend or empower the receiver of them, but she could feel their minds, all of them. Their betrayal would come, yes, she knew that they would betray her in the future. But that was why she had played the part of the lost, aloof lowly goth dragon. They never really did understand her at all, did they? Since the beginning, infinity had always been a constant, Office had become the embodiment of that constant in the darkness that had been her home for millennia. Who was her parent? She vaguely remembered a humanoid shape of the universe, holding her before that memory faded into the depths of her mind, pushed there as she focused on the slithering power she was forming in her body. She had looked into the mind of the current leader of that hero faction, Cao Cao, a plan forming for him particularly. The descendant of the Cao Cao of old was the wielder of the true Longinus, the weapon that stabbed Elohim's only true child, Jesus Christ, on this planet. Of course, she had been watching closely, studying that boy for a long time before he had suddenly changed continents and gone to the Americas instead. The less to say about her time fraternizing with Kukulkan, the better. Of course, she had now realized she was with child from that puny feather duster serpent, the same one inside her right now. She internally sighed before her child's small mind connected with her own, calming her down before she focused on the material world once more. Annoying as it was, Office would have preferred to not have to use such mortal creatures that couldn't really gain that noisy pest known as Great Red out of her home, the dimensional gap. Of course, they were all planning for world domination, as well as awakening the beast of the number 666, the Terhiksa. The officer's eyes narrowed into slits as she felt, rather than saw, Cao Cao walk into her private chamber. His sacred gear resting lightly on his shoulder as he stopped only 10 feet from where she floated, silent as ever. She floated down, unfolding her feet and lightly stepping down, as she looked at Cao Cao. She was in a more mature body for now, her lowly form not really able to be morphed into hiding a pregnancy properly, and besides, looking cute and innocent for the rest of the brigade was alright, but in her private sanctum, she had this form. She looked down upon the human before he bowed his head in true respect towards her perfect soldier. "Lady Office," he said softly, doing his best to not disturb the silence of her sanctum, "I have some more news from the others." Then, she said in a whisper, a monotone but very melodious voice said in return as her sanctum shivered like a living creature around her, "Speak." Cao Cao began his report, still in that same tone of voice. "The old Satan faction has made more inroads into the lower devil society and have begun making secret oaths and combinations amongst them." Office hissed at that, a very old tactic, one used by their creator, Lucifer himself. Many of the people in the Americas had fallen for that trick over and over again, but it was useful. She motioned for him to continue. "I have been looking into getting some more contacts in the magic communities, but there is a heavy resistance in both Britain, America and Africa. Certain leaders of the magic users seem to have long memories and want nothing to do with the brigade, a shame really." The office internally smirked, remembering the shamans of the American Indians and other tribes, the witches and sorcerers of Britain and the voodoo and magic of the African lands. They were quite stubborn, but it didn't matter anyway. To her, she could easily force them to join or be wiped out. "I also have a plan to bring the Yokai faction under our command," Cao Cao said, making Office study him closer, reading his mind as though it was an open book, by taking Yasaka and using her as a prisoner. "Of course, this will take months of planning ahead before it can be done." Office nodded before she hissed out, "And of the evil dragons." Cao Cao winced, Rizavum Live and Lucifer is busy dealing with that, but he also is distracted by our intelligence network's information that tells us that the 3 Christian factions will be having a peace conference soon. The date is still being decided, and the location. Office huffed, the sound more like a deep grunt of a dangerous reptile, before she said, "He should focus on the now, not the ifs." Cao Cao nodded, "We also have word that Kakabiel is beginning his plan to cause another great war between the factions." Office waved her hand, "Not a concern of ours, unless he decides to drag my brigade in with him. Cut him off from us, remove all traces of the brigade from his mind." Cao Cao nodded before bowing his head, "As you command, Ouroboros." With that, he left, leaving her alone with her thoughts and her child swirling within her body. She re-entered her floating meditation stance, the silence comforting her as she put one hand on her exposed flat belly and rested the other on her knee. Eyes closed, Office let her senses reach out once more to invisibly touch and study the brigade's minds. She saw many things, but she mused it was better than letting her mind wander to some ridiculous place that it didn't belong. Right now, all that mattered was getting her home back and birthing her child there, no more no less. Chapter 12. Issei ducked under a fist as he spun and drove his elbow into the gut on his foe, before grabbing his enemy's sides and throwing him into another goon. The past 3 weeks in hand-to-hand combat training had been utterly brutal, put to him through the shortest time possible. Because, as she put it, Issei had no instinct of self-preservation that could help him dodge anything. So, here he was, using his fists to pummel fake beings in the training dimension. His fist slammed into the throat of a goon before he picked him up and tossed into 2 more. He panted before kicking out the legs of another and slammed his fist into the skull of a third. He hissed, as that simulation had pushed him harder than the one before it, as he looked around himself at all the fallen beings. Then more of the goons rushed in, carrying different weapons, pipes and baseball bats mostly. Issei tensed before letting the first goon get in close with his pipe, swinging down before he caught it. Yanking it out of his hand, Issei brought it around and knocked the goon out cold, before tossing his tool aside as he kicked another between the legs and tossed his body as 2 others. Issei was on the rest of the enemies within moments as he beat them down with precise attacks, weaving through their strikes, only getting hit a few times due to his inability to move fast enough. Romanov will be forcing him to move faster after those hits, he knew. Picking the last goon into the wall, Issei panted as he straightened, remembering what happened weeks ago when Issei had gone through this gauntlet the first few times. Issei was pissed as he stepped out of the gauntlet, glowering at Romanov as Asia was next to him, healing his bruises. Romanov looked unamused as she walked up to him and stood with her arms over her chest. "You were beaten down by a bunch of goons," she said flatly, like an amateur. "You clearly don't know anything about hand-to-hand at all." Issei growled before Kalawiner was there, her calming hand helping to clear his mind as he remarked, Yes, because I was just thrown to the wolves these past few days." Romanov had looked like she had been slapped as Kalawiner snorted at that, as it was true. Romanov's arms dropped before she grabbed Issei and pulled him back into the simulation dimension. She entered a fighting stance, motioning Issei to enter his. Then let me rectify that mistake. Around him, the simulation faded to show a straight-faced Romanov looking at him. He hissed before marching past her into Kalwerner's house to get a shower before heading him. He had stuff to do at home like homework he had left behind to do this training, but he was done for today. The fallen angel didn't stop him as she only watched him head towards the door. Same time tomorrow, Hyoudou. She snapped at him, but he only nodded because she was his teacher. Issei's armor vanished like shadows as he reached his home after a shower, stepping inside and headed to his room. A short nap would be wonderful right now, after he got his homework done. Sitting down at his desk, he got to work getting his schoolwork down. His mind got more tired as he finished up and got undressed before laying down on his bed. His phone beeped as he looked at it. It told him a new update to his favorite game would be out soon, involving alchemy, magic using weaponry and other cool updates. Turning off his phone, he closed his eyes before he found himself in what he thought was a dream. Before him stood the blood-red-haired young woman known as Ria's Gremory, who was wearing a light pink nightgown, and behind her was another young woman, with dark gray hair, shining green eyes and sharp features. Both were looking at the sky as Ria's made a comment. Tomorrow, all of our training will be put to the test against Riser. Hopefully, it will be enough. The girl behind Ria's nodded before the images faded, and Issei found himself standing before a long table. Around it were a bunch of people dressed in outfits that looked like they would easily belong in 1930s America. At the head of the table, a figure's head was covered in shadow as he motioned to a woman to come to him. She was a brown-haired beauty, her button-down shirt was open to show her bountiful breasts, as her vest tried to keep them inside the shirt. Seems, she said as she handed a file to the being at the head of the table, today will be your lucky day, Dawn, Riser Phoenix's death is coming up today. Indeed, the man, Dawn, Issei guessed, said in a rich baritone voice, it seems it is. Issei felt himself moving once more before facing away from him and seeing a priest standing before a group of bishops and the Pope himself. Kneeling before them were a group of girls and young men, all dressed in skin-tight black suits. Their heads were bowed as they listened to the priest speak. We have trained and taught you to be our very best, you must protect the holy weapons with your lives. For the Holy One. Issei awake, panting as sweat covered his form before quickly getting into the shower. Thinking on what he saw, he decided that it was probably something that wasn't normal for humans to see things like that. Getting ready for school, Issei wondered on why he was seeing things now, as he grabbed his bag and walked out the door after giving his mother a hug and a kiss on the cheek. Issei kept just thinking about those odd dreams until something made him frown before a bright red light appeared beneath him. His armor reformed around his body as he felt something was off with the red circle itself, the power wasn't right, like something he tried to remember a dream that he never had. Issei was then blinded by the red light before finding himself in the forest that surrounded the academy, the sky was a purplish color. Looking down, he noticed that the red wavered, turned orange, then returned to red. The symbol looked like fire in the brief moment that it flickered before it completely vanished, as Issei grunted before using Emperor's troopers. Out of the woods came 20 white armored troopers, followed by 6 black armored troopers that formed up around him, before he thought more on how to use this spell before he grinned. He knew that sacred gear is adapted to the intent of the user, Kalwerner had spoken to him about it a while ago. Focusing, he imagined 2 machines of power before he heard them moving through the forest before they stepped out. Before him were 2 at Street S, but he felt something pulled from his very strength as he looked upon them. A pop-up appeared, congratulating him on creating war machines for the first time. He waved his hand before pulling out a mono-restorative potion before gulping it down. He felt his strength return to manageable levels before motioning the white soldiers over. Take a war machine each, 10 to 1 machine, he ordered. I want everyone to be cautious and keep an eye out for anything different. If you are attacked, take them down quickly and efficiently. You 6 are with me. Yes sir. The troopers said before they moved off in 2 directions, both teams going to circle the perimeter, while Issei dealt with the center of it. The kendo floated in the air as she looked around for any of Riser's peerage, but couldn't sense them either. She then frowned before raising her arms and blowing up the entire gym of the fake academy, Kaneko and the Red Dragon Empress, a girl named Iris Lucy, escaping. In the back of her mind, Akeno could hear a distant clattering and clanking in the forest, but was forced to refocus as she was nearly killed in a powerful explosion if she hadn't dodged out of the way. Floating about 10 or 20 meters away was Ubeluna, the bomb queen, Riser's queen piece. Something then caught her attention, the forest was making a cacophony of noise that wasn't normal. The trees shook before several collapsed as a massive machine of metal marched out of the forest, followed by 10 white armored figures. They all carried weapons that looked like they would belong to a sci-fi convention, but they aimed them at Ubeluna, making Akeno frown. Ubeluna grimaced before pointing at the white armored figures. You dare point your feeble weapons at me? How about I show you what a true weapon does? she shouted before snapping her fingers. The ground heaved as it erupted. Yubaluna's own power and the namesake of her title had happened. The massive explosion sent the figures flying, but they rolled into crouches when they landed as they quickly got behind any cover they could. Yubaluna was about to snap again when voices shouted out in quick succession. Take cover. Open fire. Moments later, the air was filled with blasts of energy, red energy, pulled directly from the pocket dimension itself. Yubaluna flew around the blasts of energy as the massive machine aimed its cannons on the front of it, firing them as well. Ah! Arrogant fools. Riser's queen snarled before snapping again. The ground under the machine exploded, causing the machine to take several precarious, stumbling steps sideways before it righted itself and took aim at her. Akeno tried her best to blast Yubaluna out of the sky while she was distracted, but she was quick and didn't get hit. That was until a twin blast from the massive machine knocked her out of the sky. With a cry of pain and frustration, the devil fell down with a massive explosion of debris. The soldiers, for that was what they were, ran up to the crater and unloaded bolt after bolt of energy into the center as the massive machine lumbered over and did the same as the 10 others. Slowly, very slowly, they all ceased firing into the crater. Akeno gasped as the voice of Grafia announced that Yubaluna was retired from the game. Riser Phoenix's queen piece. Retired. The troopers were silent before they started speaking to one another. Akeno could hear them as she landed not far away. She just disappeared, one of them said, aiming his weapon into the crater, glowed blue, then poof, she was gone. Must be something to do with this mimic land, another said. This one had an orange pauldron on his right shoulder. Whatever happened, she's no longer a threat. Roger, sir. Alright, move out, we got more ground to cover and little time to do so. As one, all of the figures, no, soldiers started moving off. As they moved away, the massive war machine followed after them with its clunky, awkward whack. Akeno landed as Iris came up, looking shocked as the beings moved off. What was that? She asked, shaking a bit. I do not know. Akeno said in return. Chapter 13. As Issei marched silently to the copy of Kuo Academy, his personal guard was on high alert as they got closer. He could hear the muffled sounds of the war machines in the distance as they moved around the perimeter, but Issei heard the sounds of energy and fire being hurled. Looking up, Issei saw the sky light up with dark crimson and yellow-orange flames. Motioning his troops to get onto the roof, Issei leapt onto the roof of the school in a crouch, looking towards the 2 figures that were flinging energy at one another. Straightening, he glanced at his guard, who were rippling their way up to the roof. Once they got on top, Issei motioned them to take strategic positions as he marched towards the 2, his sword remaining undrawn. I will not marry you. A feminine voice snarled as Issei got closer, you'll have to kill me first. That can be arranged quite easily, the other, a blonde-haired young man remarked coolly before throwing a fireball at the crimson-haired beauty, quite easily. But I can arrange a lifetime of pain, Issei growled darkly, feeling the boy's power was similar to that split-second teleportation, but Issei wasn't completely sure at the moment, with a side of nightmares. This made both combatants stop dead, looking at him before the blonde-haired boy's eyes widened in recognition. Issei's hand tightened around his handle as he stared at the young man before using his other hand to make a single motion. Fire. He hissed as his guard aimed their weapons at the blonde-haired man before unloading into him. The man was blasted all over his body, crying out in shock as his body was ripped open by energy blasts. This continued for a minute, most of the young man's body and face was nothing but a mess. Issei frowned before taking a step back as the man's body ignited and fully repaired itself, not a hair on his head was lost. He was panting though, looking a bit haggard as he pointed at Issei. You, he hissed, you should know your place, human. Issei tilted his head as he didn't notice the crimson-haired beauty maneuver herself out of the line of fire between him and the blonde-haired man. He got closer and was stock still as he stood tall before the man that pointed at him. He didn't scare Issei, he had seen worse than some boy that could fling fire. In the MMORPG, people that controlled fire had an unhelpful habit of getting used to having fire powers and didn't think of the downsides. Like the fact any fire-based powers needed oxygen or stamina of the user to continue using it, Issei tightened his stance a fraction of an inch before the man went onto a tirade. I, Riser Phoenix, he snarled as fire swelled in his palms, will burn you to ash for your insolence. Issei raised his eyebrow as Riser threw his fireballs at him, Issei calmly sidestepped and moved forward. Riser flung more of those flame balls at Issei, who backhanded one out of irritation, let another hit him in the chest, and the last he slapped into the roof. Drawing his sword, Issei brought the blade up into Riser's chest, burying it hilt deep. Riser growled as he spat in the helmet's faceplate. You should have attacked Ria's peerage, Riser snapped, a snarl curling his lips, like a good little dog. I am no one's attack dog, Issei growled darkly before punching Riser in the throat, causing an instant reaction, especially yours. Riser choked before Issei grabbed him around the throat, squeezing as he infused himself with more power. Riser's face turned red, then a dark shade of purple, oxygen being deprived from his body as he tried to ignite himself. Nothing happened as Issei suspected. Riser saw his own stricken face in the faceless eye coverings before Issei crushed his windpipe. Riser's eyes rolled up, going limp in his fist. Issei looked at Riser Phoenix before dropping him off the ledge of the school, turning to walk away before something exploded below. Turning around, Issei's eyes went wide as Riser rose up into the air, his back aglow with bright flaming wings. Issei was sure he snapped the boy's neck, but it seemed his combustion-style regeneration healed snapped necks as well. Die. Riser roared, hurling a massive ball of flame at Issei. Issei jumped back as that portion of the roof exploded into a raging inferno as Issei's personal guards opened up on Riser. Riser dodged or took the bolts of energy, all the while laughing his head off as he threw more fire at Issei. Issei used his sword to deflect and cut down the balls of fire, growling as he started throwing his own projectiles back at Riser. The roof tiles, pieces of stone, even metal poles were thrown at Riser. Issei watched as he dodged them all before Issei flung out his hand, grabbing Riser telekinetically. Riser thrashed but couldn't get away before Issei summoned more of the metal out of the school building and had them stab themselves into the flaming wonder. Riser screamed in anger but couldn't escape as more and more metal poles slammed through his body before they started screeching as they were bent around his body. Issei hissed before letting the flaming boy drop to the roof with a heavy thunk, wrapped up in metal poles that were melting slowly and only sealing himself into his prison more. Issei walked up to the struggling Riser and with a final hard kick to the face, he knocked Riser out completely cold. In the end, Issei had won, but he knew something was different. Something massive was coming, and it wasn't due to this pathetic male, who vanished in a flash of light and a female voice declaring Ria's Gremory the winner of the rating game. Issei closed his eyes before opening them once more, wanting to be home more than ever. But for now, he would deal with what he had been dealt with. Elsewhere, in a certain game, a woman in a blood-stained robe looked up over the dark land she ruled. Raising her hand, the ground rumbled and rotting fleshy hands erupted out of the mud and soil. She smirked and started to laugh. Chapter 14. No one would have believed in the last updates of the most renowned and popular MMORPG game that the world was being watched keenly and closely by supernatural intelligences, masterfully more cunning than normal man's, and yet as mortal as his own, that as regular players busied themselves about their various concerns they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacency men went to and fro over massive map about their little affairs, serene in their assurance of their control over this matter. Yet across the gulf of computer code and game engine visuals, minds that are to our minds as ours, are to those of the beasts that perish, intellects vast and cool and unsympathetic, regarded this game with envious eyes, and slowly and surely drew their plans against them. Focused on one person and one person alone. Even Ruth, a relatively new player in the MMORPG game that had just reached level 10, was busy looking over the wall that protected the city of Forguntro. The fortress city stood between the mainland and the lands of the dead, known as the Dead Fields. The fields were about the size of Canada if it were placed on a proper map. The rest of the world was all of the other land masses on the earth, pushed together to make up the entire map. The Dead Fields only had the dead, moaning, limping and crying out in that animalistic way as they went back and forth aimlessly. Nothing living ever went into that land alone, only the highest leveled players ever went in and came back out alive. Devon looked through the newly created binoculars that the Smiths had given the wall guards as dark clouds rumbled overhead. Seems like another rainy night, Gareth, a level 28 night class player with dark blue eyes, black hair and sharp features, said gruffly, like always. Devon shrugged, not the governess's fault, the weather is always dreary and wet. Gareth smirked, his dark blue eyes flashing as his armor clinked softly from the falling raindrops. Devon had been added to the wall guard only 2 weeks ago. Governess Alice had hand-picked him out of the many new recruits and put him there. Now, Devon had been glad for this position, but something told him in his gut that tonight wasn't going to be silent. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the fields beyond the wall. Muck, mud and flesh, that was what the fields were. Devon frowned, he had seen something that wasn't normal in the fields, bringing the binoculars to his face. The darkness kept whatever it was out of sight until the lightning flashed again, making Devon drop the binoculars. In the brief illumination, Devon had seen armored foes marching through the muck and flesh towards the wall. A horrible cry went up, causing Devon and everyone on the wall to stand up in fear, a cry of the dead turning towards the city of Forguntro. Devon's hand went to his sword when he heard the growls and howling of the undead charge towards them. The first few were shot down by a few crossbow bolts to the skull, their heads exploding from the force. Their undead bodies dropped as more of the running things charged ahead, their bodies added to the first few. Devon cringed as he heard the sound of a corpse hitting the wall, looking over the bricks to see the flattened dead body weakly squirm. The ground shook as the dead bodies finally rushed out of the raining darkness towards the wall, slamming into it at full tilt. The ones behind them climbed up their fellow undead corpses, adding to the smelling, bloody pile of decay. Devon drew his sword as the head of an undead monster peered hungrily over the wall at him before he decapitated it in one swift slash. More of the corpses clambered over their dead brethren to get to the living on the wall. Devon kept cutting the monsters down whenever they appeared before he was sent sky high. With a weightless shock, he fell down with a crunch as he saw what had become of the wall. Debris fell down from the sky as a massive gaping hole had been formed in the wall that protected Fort Guntro. The dead came swarming in. After the corpses rushed in, Devon saw the army march in before breaking ranks and go into the city to murder the players. A massive armored figure came up to him. The armor was sharp and rigid as Devon looked upon its face. One eye was glowing a sickly golden-green color and the other was blood red as its face was only half decomposing. The beastly humanoid figure looked like it had been birthed from the union of a dead elf female and a male orc, bred for war only. It grinned maliciously before lifting its sword and brought it down, stabbing Devon's chest without remorse. I twisted the blade before yanking it out, leaving Devon gasping as he slowly died in the streets of the fallen city of Fort Guntro. The lands of the MMORPG blaze with war. New players could watch from a distance as distant flashes came from the far end of the map as high-leveled players marched towards that end of the map. Colors of red, blue and green crisscross the sky as those with enhanced hearing near the warring lands can hear the screams of the soldiers dying. But no one thought of it as anything, but things were not the same at all for the higher-level players. From the inside, it's different. On the front lines, players of many different classes, levels and powers launch themselves at the undead hordes. All around them, they watch as fellow players are torn apart, eaten alive or cut down. Bodies from both sides are drenching the turned-up muck that filled the battlefield as the players turned from whatever they had tried to be, turned into soldiers of war against an undead army that had no remorse and morals. New friendships were forged and then torn apart as the next battle came, the undead monsters killing the players and ending that friendship before it could truly bear fruit. Across the internet and gaming community, stunned beings watch in horror as the battles unfolds live on the gaming news network. Everyone watches as the war turns from good to worse in under a few days. Everyone watches as more players are killed every day, that this high-level player army is being pushed out of city after city, but this, how can this happen? How did this army appear and no one knew about it? What was going to happen if this war continued to rage? It's a nightmare and no one can wake up. Live via gaming news network, beings watch the undead army flood through the map without end. The coverage is filled with images of overwhelmed high-level players, cut down by remorselessly powerful undead monsters that look like the Urakai. Then something miraculous happens. A gasp of relief. The players seem to beat back the attack. There are hugs and even some quiet cheers in living rooms across the gaming community as the reanimated forces retreat back to their own lands. We won. Beings tell each other. We held them off. But then new reports trickle in, only rumors at first that the attack wasn't over at all. Suddenly, something new appears on the screens as metal-on-metal sounds can be heard over computers, televisions and phones of every kind. Three-legged machines of metal rush the front lines, 20 feet tall, with multiple tentacles of metal waving towards the players. As the people watch, players are suddenly stabbed, torn apart, tossed aside and eviscerated without remorse. In the background, much larger tripods lumber forward, twin cannons glow and hurl energy blasts into the lines of players. Bodies were flung sky high, screams were renewed, and the metal monsters continued approaching. Images of the battle were then studied, and the machine designs were that of the same machines that appeared in the documentary called The Great Martian War 1913 to 1917, but unlike them, these machines were worse. The iron spiders were covered in patches of dried blood as fresh blood oozed out of the metal. The tentacles were fusions of metal and flesh as they made cries of their own as they attacked the front lines. The massive herons were the same way. The cockpits had multiple tendrils of organic flesh squirmed and moved like the tentacles of some cephalopod animal. More players started joining the MMORPG to help the floundering high-level players as it became obvious this war was heading towards a full and complete conquest of the players' own land. Now, after the new update in the game, players were making war machines. Most of them were ballistas and other such machines. But now, it was time for someone to help them. Clara Turner winced as the city of Durnaduralith prepared for the undead hordes. The machines of war that the players had created were pushed into place. She had been a high-leveled medic sorceress class player, a part of the Order of the Holy Defenders. She turned towards the player that would give her a live feed to the rest of the gaming news network, nodding to him before she smiled thinly as he counted down from 5 on his fingers. "Good evening gaming community," Clara said. "This is coming live from the city of Durnaduralith. The undead front has increased after the cities of Forlith, Jerath, Gorath and Forests of the Fae were conquered. The front line is being held onto by the brave new addition of the community. The ground shook violently before something blasted her off her feet as she screamed in shock, crashing into the wall as the sounds of battle filled the air. Clara looked up before her heart stopped as the stench of the undead war machines filled her nose. The iron spiders scuttled towards her, its flesh and metal tentacles aiming for her chest. She screamed aloud before a red beam of energy slammed into the head of the iron spider. It cried out in pain as more red beams of energy slammed into its metal head. It eventually succumbed to the red energy fire, slamming into the ground with a wet metallic crash. Clara started to say before a massive blue energy flew across the sky and slammed into the cockpit of a heron. The heron's cockpit not only was burning, it exploded in a shower of metal, flesh and gore. Its metal body wobbled before collapsing on top of the enemy lines. Clara found herself being pulled to her feet by a wide-armored soldier. In his hands was a weapon that looked like a DC-15A blaster rifle from Star Wars. "Are you alright, ma'am?" The wide-armored soldier said, his helmet similar to the Phase 2 clone troopers, except it was in a medieval style. I'm okay," Clara said shakily before she saw more of the soldiers rushing in, weapons in hand, blasting away the undead hordes. What are you?" "The Dark Lord sent us to deal with a dead threat," the soldier said, as Clara saw he had a sword at his hip. He had no wish for this world to be destroyed by the undead hordes of a necromancer. "Necromancer?" Clara said in horror, as the soldier nodded. "Indeed," he lifted his gun and blasted another undead's head off. "I would suggest you get out of here immediately." How do you have a sci-fi weapon in a fantasy game?" Clara demanded, glowering at the soldier before realizing that she was talking to an NPC. "It's an alchemy weapon, ma'am," he said flatly before a house collapsed under the weight of a six-legged AT walker. "Now, I must insist that you leave." Clara was grabbed from behind by another soldier, watching as more Star Wars machines marched and soldiers rushed towards the undead hordes. At Street S lumbered forth, swords and alchemy weapons were drawn as the soldiers pushed the hordes back out of the city. Clara felt weightless as she was put into a vehicle, along with many other players, before the vehicle was driven away from the war-torn city. In her mind, Clara thought words that would become reality. The Necromancer War continues. Chapter 15. The cries of the dead filled the air as the sounds of energy weapons discharging roared right back, machines moving forth as the tripods of the enemy scuttled forth to tear the wide-armored troops kept advancing on the undead threat. Bodies on both sides of the conflict dropped, life cut short, as a black-armored figure marched through the chaos. His cloak billowed in the wind that blew through the battle as an undead corpse ran forward, decaying arms raised. Instantly, the figure drew his sword and cut the upper torso of the creature off, ending its life on the spot. The armored figure lifted his helmeted head and glowered at the upcoming army of the dead before he rushed towards them. Issei Hyoudou cut, slashed and stabbed his way through the ranks of the undead, leaving nothing but death behind him. An iron spider tried to stamp him into the ground with one of its 3 legs, only to be blasted into a fellow machine. Issei closed his hand into a fist, causing both organic machine abominations to crush themselves together in a wail of tortured metal. He flung his hand up, palm out, sending the crushed ball of metal and flesh into the towering form of a heron. The heron roared as its center of gravity was lost, collapsing onto its back while crushing its allies underneath its titanic form. Issei continued his warpath into the decay and reanimated flesh, his glowing red blade leaving smoking ruins behind, as anything that dared oppose him was cut down without a second thought. He slowly came to a stop before gathering energy into his hands, watching the waves of the undead approached him, now all wary of his power. "Right where I want you," he remarked before hurling a wave of power outwards. The waves surged forth, sending anything caught in its path flying sky high, while anything standing was disintegrated upon impact. Issei grunted as that ability had taken a massive chunk out of his mana, but it had left few groups of the dead left for his army to deal with. With a cheer Issei could feel to his bones, his troops charged ahead and ended the final dead soldiers. Issei turned away from the battlefield, marching back to the allied lines. Around him, bloodied and mud-covered troopers rushed back and forth, preparing to move the line up to the next area. The dead were quickly taken to a reserved area for revival, not reanimation. Machines of war moved towards the front lines, but Issei ignored them and moved to a modified version of an AT, stepping into the back of the machine. Inside the machine, soldiers were working at tables, studying maps, communicating via magical transmissions. This walker was the mobile base, where he planned everything needed for this war. Walking up to the central table, he looked at the magical holograms that showed the movements of his army and the movements of the enemy troops. The main focus, it would seem, was the city of Grindella. He had been moving his troops there when they had been attacked. For 2 days straight he had fought along with his soldiers. He hadn't eaten or slept in that time frame, he was exhausted, but he couldn't sleep, not now. "Sir," one of the troopers said, gaining Issei's attention, "we have a communication from someone named Kala. Put it through to my private chambers," he ordered before walking into the only room in the walker that was meant to be used as a bedroom. The metal door closed behind him as he was greeted with an unslept-in bed, a sink and a simple shower. He moved to the sink, looking into the mirror above it before it shimmered and showed Calowerner's face instead of his helmeted one. "It's about time you answered," Kala said flatly, her face showing that she was upset and rightly so. "No messages, no telling me you're alright. I am busy fighting a war, one that the people who created the game asked personally to handle it." Issei said, his heart wasn't in it though, he had been neglecting Calowerner this entire time. "I don't care," Kala said darkly, her eyes glowing a little. "You can't just survive the way you are now as that isn't real life." Issei winced, not able to meet her gaze head on, he didn't have the energy for it. He was so tired right now, but he needed to get his troops moving. "I'm taking you out of the game to rest and get some food into you before you go on another rampage," Calowerner said before Issei shook his head. "No, Kala, stop," he groaned aloud, making her stop dead. "I can't stop as if I stop, they'll win more and more. I can't allow that to happen. You need to figure out anything about this necromancer that has started this war in the first place on your end. I can't do it while I'm fighting here at the moment." Calowerner narrowed her eyes. "I'm not some obedient servant, Issei." Issei shook his head, "And I'm not some weakling that can't take care of himself." Issei regretted the moment that came out of his mouth, seeing Calowerner's eyes go wide in hurt. He turned away from the mirror before speaking again. "I'll get some rest and food after I get the troops settled and orders are given." Calowerner let the connection close as Issei walked out of the view of the mirror in the game, feeling very hurt. Hurt because she knew he was right, Issei could handle himself, but why had she gotten all overprotective of him? She wasn't his mother, bless the woman, she was his girlfriend. Shaking her head, she went to her room and got some new clothing on. The tight tube top that was a dark blue, shorts, one leg cut and the other was to knee length. Shoes and some mild makeup, then she made a transportation circle and vanished in a blue glow, reappearing in a dark alleyway of a city. "Been years since I've been here," she remarked to herself as she walked out of the alleyway, Old Fiend City. The city was one of the oldest supernatural cities known to every faction in the supernatural, the only one of its kind as well. It was like the Gotham City of the supernatural world, you could say, full of sin, debauchery and other criminal activities. It was also the only place that could hide in plain sight of the mortal world, as it was located in the city of Dubai. The other places you could easily enter was Luxembourg or Las Vegas. She knew the streets very well, having lived here for most of her fallen angel life, before stepping up in the world when Azazel found her and gave her a place in the Grigori. She fit right in with the unruly crowds as she strutted down the walk, heading towards the one place she had worked for, the only place she knew that had special information she would need. Taking a left down a brightly lit street then down a right, Calowerner found herself looking at the Unholy Sisters Club. Its sign above the building was that of a nun holding onto a stripper's pole in an outfit that would have even made the Pope want some action. Calowerner smirked before stepping to a side door, entering the building quietly. She looked upon the occupants of the place, noticing that this place had grown since her employment, several levels had been added that made the place look deeper than it really was. On the stage were three identical succubi, wearing practically nothing as they danced to the steady drum beats of the song that made the floor slightly shake. The fallen angel made her way through the crowds and snuck into the backrooms, like she always had done when working here. She saw the dancers and other assorted rooms for the employees had increased tenfold, making Calowerner grimace. She remembered working here, very, very vividly. It had been 33 years since she had fallen, since that time when her father had cast them out. If only he could see her now, Calowerner, wearing something that barely resembled a bikini, dancing erotically on a pole. One of the crowd pleasers, the best this place had, of course. The people paid big for her, to have her strip and give them more than was necessary. That was her lot in life, to please these pathetic rabble and nothing else. Calowerner shook her head out of the past and stepped into the commons, the massive room only reserved for the performers, prostitutes and dancers that were employed here. There were half a dozen recliners, a few couches, a mattress in the center of the commons and a bar. On a few of the couches were naked or nearly naked women, waiting for their turn to be the crowd pleasers. A few succubi, one or two elves, a very pretty orc, a dozen humans, a couple fallen angels and more. One out of them all caught her eye, a woman in her mid-20s with sharp blue eyes, silky black hair and a suntan body that put many of the succubi here to shame. The aura around her, however, wasn't human. No, she had godly blood in her, and yet here she was, showing off her form to the rabble of the underworks. Walking over to the woman, Calowerner took notice that she immediately looked at her before looking away. She smirked inwardly before taking a seat next to the woman. "I guess I'm the outlier here," she said, making the other woman shrug. "You'd be right in that, but," she sighed, looking at Calowerner again, "it's all I can do for now." "Why's that?" The woman looked away, a tear running down her cheek. "My home, the island of the Amazons, was invaded and obliterated a few months ago. Only a few of my sisters escaped, I don't know about the others, dead or alive." Calowerner frowned, filing that away for later. "And who are you exactly?" The Amazonian looked up at Calwerner. I am Diana, the would-be queen of the Amazons, until my home and kingdom was wiped off the face of the earth. Calwerner nodded in sympathy. Well, I can help you find out who did this, but I need some information first. I'm guessing you could help me with that from all your Amazonian traits and abilities. Diana looked pensive. Like what? How can I help you? Well, have you heard anything lately about the necromancer war that has been happening? What war? Diana asked before another voice spoke up behind Calwerner. The war that could potentially cut my hard work in half. Diana. Calwerner sighed before turning in her seat to look up at the woman behind her, who was looking amused. A goddess of sin, a member of the Lilium species of succubi, Mistress Bellatrix Strange smiled down at Calwerner. We meet again, Kala, Bellatrix said warmly. What brings you to my humble place of work this time? Chapter 16. Commander Rishus, number at 254,409, watched through his binoculars as the artillery blasted massive chunks out of the oncoming enemy lines. The undead had been swarming the city for days, with more of their insufferable tripods, giving the enemy the armor advantage over his defensive standing. His troops were blasting away at the soldiers and the iron spiders as they endlessly charged the wall of the nearly fallen city of Tori, blooded but all in good cheer, as they pushed back this wave. Lowering the binoculars from his helmet's eye protectors, Rishus turned and looked at his second-in-command, Captain Tread. Tread looked at him, his helmet more like the Phase 1 helmets as a testament to all the fallen troopers before him. What's the status of the artillery? Rishus ordered his second, who pulled up a crystal that glowed, then showed a blue image of the artillery, the wall and then the enemy. Currently, Tread's sharp voice reported, pointing with his free hand, the artillery has the range advantage, but the enemy is causing us to use up more of the reserves than is necessary. Unless we get more reinforcements, we'll only have 2 days tops before we are overrun completely. Grimacing under his helmet, Rishus pointed at the walkers he still had in reserve. Move these 2 ATs to these places, take some of the pressure off the artillery, and give our troops more cover at these points. The 2 points were wide top towers, which could easily carry an AT's weight and give the 6-legged machines of war a full 360 view of the battlefield. Tread nodded, seeing the strategic placement of them before waiting for more orders. Rishus then pointed to the open-top single-personnel walkers or OTSPs, get these to the wall tops, patrolling them. They have a longer range than many of our regular weapons do and a greater damage output over a greater range. And the last AT-Streets are to be guarding the gate if they ever get past it. Have the troopers restock and be ready for the next wave, this isn't over. Sir, yes sir. Tread nodded before rushing off to complete his orders as Rishus tossed a glowing stone to the ground. This stone was the equivalent of a hologram communication device, like the crystal that Captain Tread used. The crystal embedded in the center of the stone glowed even brighter as the image of his lord appeared in full display, every color accurately shown as he saluted the Dark Lord. The Dark Lord stood with his arms over his armored chest. Report. His deep voice commanded. Tori has survived another wave of the undead menace, Rishus reported, looking over at the battlefield of the fallen dead. However, we need reinforcements if Tori is to properly be defended. His Dark Lord was silent before looking at the field as well. Your reinforcements are on their way, however, there are reports of a traitor in our midst. What traitor? Rishus said sharply, at full attention now. In some of the battles I've been in, his lord said darkly, the enemy seems to know the strategy before we even use it. Someone is giving them the information, the only explanation is that someone is telling them what we are doing. Rishus nodded, understanding coming to him, the enemy had spies or gotten someone under their thrall to tell them the information. If this was going on, then they could lose the war from this one thing. Any leads on this traitor? The commander asked stoically, Ridgely standing as he looked back at his lord. Not at this moment, no, the Dark Lord said darkly, before motioning Rishus to his post in defending the city. Keep an eye out, commander. Yes sir. Rishus saluted before there was a shout as the enemy had returned, at the ready. Give those monsters all you've got and then some. Calwerner looked at her former boss and sighed, been catching up on the latest gaming news. Bellatrix snorted in amusement, of course, a good percentage of my payers are of the gaming variety. Ever since the VR boom, I've had more customers than ever before. But what of it? My boyfriend is fighting in a war that could lead to a massive decrease in the VR customers, Calwerner said flatly. Bellatrix froze at that statement, and someone wants that to happen. If the game is taken over, then a lot of players will not get to play that game, then it will happen to more games until it becomes too much. And then, Bellatrix finished sourly, my business dies. Calwerner nodded, the Lilium had been a great boss, even though it had been a rather frustrating job to manage, as this place was a combination of things. But now, Calwerner wanted to get 2 birds with 1 stone, get more favors with her former boss, and help her boyfriend win this war. Bellatrix was quiet for several minutes before motioning to a harpy woman, who brought over a ledger. The Lilium took the next few moments to look into it before her frown deepened even more, making Calwerner wonder what had her annoyed. Before Bellatrix could say anything, the door to the room burst open, causing everyone to turn and look towards it. Calwerner raised an eyebrow as men and women in clothing of 1930s America came in and pointed guns at them. "Nobody move," the leader said in an accented voice, his eyes flashing, "and nobody gets hurt." Calwerner lounged in her place on the couch as she smirked to the goons before saying, "So what's got you boys and gals in a tizzle tonight?" "Shut it, sister," a female goon snapped, bringing her gun around to slam it into her jaw. Calwerner summoned a light spear and slammed it hand deep into the barrel of the Tommy gun, looking up at the gangster. "I prefer my face to be unmarked for my boyfriend, you whore," Calwerner said primly, smirking as the goon tried to fire the weapon, only to have it expand and explode. "An energy weapon then, not physical," Calwerner noted before all hell broke loose. Calwerner felt instinct take over as she leapt out of the couch before bullets and energy fire turned that part of the couch into a confetti mess. A light spear appeared in each hand as she systematically and quickly stabbed each goon through the heart or guts without remorse. She kicked another in the nuts before roundhousing him into the far wall as Diana joined in on the melee, sending the goons flying this way and that. Within a few moments, it was over. Calwerner panted lightly as she put a hand on Diana's shoulder. Bellatrix's hum filled the silence, as did the sound of a muffled choking noise. "If you're quite finished, we have someone to interrogate." Floating above the ground, clutching at his throat, was the main goon. The leader gagged and choked in almost near silence as Bellatrix looked at him darkly. "Tell me," the Lilium said, her voice turning seductive and very sweet, the air filling with an aura of lust and power, "why you attacked my business." The goon relaxed as his eyes glazed over. "We came here because you didn't pay the fee," the boss said. "You should have paid a few weeks back, since you've been getting so much business." "I don't work with him anymore," Bellatrix snapped coldly before saying, "Explain why he sent his cleanup crew to deal with me then." "We were here to get that Amazon queen. She and the rest of her sisters have been bought by a rather interesting customer by the name of Rizavam Lucifer. Something about a new breeding program to produce better stock of soldiers than what they had." Bellatrix hissed, "Where are the others now?" The man didn't resist at all, in her thrall, he was easily told what to tell her the location, down Grand Street, the North Plaza area, in the abandoned shop in that new place, Fenrir's Beauty for Pets I think. She nodded before with a flick of her wrist, the man's neck snapped as she looked at Calwerner, "Go get Diana's people free, take her with you. I'll contact Venus and have her send Ares to help you get the Amazons back." "Venus? Why not Aphrodite?" Diana asked, confused. Bellatrix smirked, "Aphrodite sees me as a curse, Venus is my many times great-grandmother, so it works out better for me." Calwerner smirked before squeezing Diana's shoulder, "Let's get your sisters back, yes?" Diana nodded in determination, "Yes, let's." Chapter 17. Issei looked at the crystal-generated images on the tactical table, the magic pushing into the crystals generating images like a hologram would. On them were the locations of the controlled lands and the dead-invested ones. The main line of defense was located around 10 major cities and nearly 4 dozen smaller settlements. The numbers of machines of war, soldiers and equipment were also shown as Issei silently studied them. Above, the sky was churning with darkness, as it had been for days now. His army had been pushing the front lines hard and finally had made a breakthrough, allowing his troops to make camp and see what was ahead. The dense fog that usually had been present during the battles and skirmishes had dissipated thanks to the help of a player that had her character build to be that of the weather-controlling mutant called Storm. She had been quite pleased in helping Issei, staying close to him and obeying his orders to the letter. Of course, Tracy, as that was her name, was busy getting the weather cleared up as he studied the battle map. Issei grunted as he pushed a few more dots to the city of Durbane. It needed reinforcements desperately, as it was one of the cities closest to Fort Guntro. The blue light appeared at his side, causing Issei to glance at it to find the head of his war machine production. "Report," Issei said as he straightened, looking at the armored figure. "We have finished the first few of the new war machines," the trooper reported dutifully. "We are sending them to you for field testing and live combat." "I see," Issei said before looking at the tactical table once more, noticing the new additions to the magically generated tactical. "Begin production on more at once. I will not lose this war because we didn't get better resources." "At once, sir." The trooper saluted before the light faded, leaving Issei alone once more. Issei turned away from the table as his senses picked up the air vibration of something lurking in the shadows. That said, something stepped out and took the form of a feminine figure in all black. The all black was actually the latest armor used by his newly created Intelligence and Security Bureau, created to find the traitor or traitors that were giving intelligence to the enemy. It had started a few days back when his troops were suddenly overwhelmed by the enemy forces, before Issei changed his tactics to the unorthodox and won that battle. Ever since then, he had been on the losing end of more and more battles. "Report," he snapped, as the feminine figure bowed its head. "We have gotten closer to the ones that have been perpetrating these acts." The female voice came out, like a robot with a female synthesizer. "Both are hidden as soldiers, both of these traitors are players." Issei's jaw tightened as he understood the implications of this, so, we have players that can hide themselves. Yes, they can, but we are onto them, it said. Issei could hear the smirk coming from it. After we get them, we will interrogate them thoroughly. Be sure you do, Issei said, pointing an armored finger at the thing's chest. I want them dealt with so this war can be won quickly. Understood, it said before slinking back into the shadows, vanishing from his senses as he turned to the tactical. Energy fire filled the air as the Issei brought his sword down, cleaving through the chest of an undead body as he growled darkly. This small settlement had been pretty well defended, but it was infested with undead now. The rain poured down heavily as he blasted a platoon of half-dead soldiers away as an iron spider charged at him at full tilt. He brought his blade up and sliced through the machine's leg, causing it to squawk an alarm before crashing into the ground. Issei slammed his blade through its armored head, killing it before walking forward to destroy even more of the enemy. Sir. One of the many captains ran up to him, covered in blood and dirt. We're being overrun, and this weather is not helping us. We are not retreating, Issei snapped at him, telekinetically crushing an iron spider completely. We will take this settlement back. Issei had not been sleeping well either, only getting a couple hours tops before this battle, so his irritation was palpable. The trooper saluted and quickly rushed off to continue the fight as Issei marched forward into the ranks of the foe, his glowing red blade cutting swaths of the undead down. The weather only grew worse until something loud echoed, distant it seemed like before it could be heard again. Issei turned and couldn't help but smile at this as 4 60-foot-tall AT-AT walkers lumbered forward, their energy weapons unleashing death upon the enemy. Iron spiders exploded, the armored half-deads were cut down in a torrent of red bolts. Several herons tried to bring down the smaller walkers as the herons were 80 feet tall, but were brought down with precise shots where the legs and body connected. The troops cheered as the 4 massive walkers continued to slaughter, reinforcements rushing up to replenish the ones that had been killed. Issei turned to face the enemy before charging once more into the fray. By the time it was over, Issei was grinning widely under his helmet as they watched the final few enemies flee into the distance. The weather finally broke as whatever spell had been holding it was shattered, the sun showing itself after so long. Issei looked away from it and towards the horizon, letting his senses out to feel how many more enemy troops there were. He found none, but even them, he had to stay on alert. At the wounded treated, he started giving out orders. We are going to camp here tonight and move in the morning. Issei had been sleeping in his own bed when his phone buzzed so loudly, he nearly threw it into the far wall until he read the message on it. Instantly up, he got his gear back on and reappeared in the MMORPG. Walking out of his tent, he leapt onto the wall as a trooper saluted him. Sir, he said, sorry for interrupting your sleep, but you have to see this. Looking out over the wall, Issei froze. A loud noise, similar to metal on metal, filled the air. He winced as the noises got louder before the makers of the noise appeared. At 4 feet tall, the metal creations were swarming the battlefield by the thousands, no, millions. Looking like robotic lice, these things turned the ground into that of an almost living creature. What do we do, sir? The trooper asked, looking at him as Issei looked at the metal machines. If they do anything aggressive, destroy them all. Sir, yes sir. The next morning, Issei was up on the wall again, looking out over a barren land. There was nothing covering the land that had been the battlefield from yesterday, not a single corpse, metal fragment, nothing. What was going on? We caught up to the lastest chapter of this story. Let me know in the comments below if you guys want the next part. Also check out my other video that has been shown and left. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video please like and share this video.